مساء الخير، أهلا ومرحبا بكم وهذه الحلقة من وول ستريت. ضيف حلقة اليوم هو شخصية مميزة في عالم الأعمال وفي عالم الصحافة، فهو رئيس أكبر مجلة للأعمال في الولايات المتحدة. عدد قراء المطبوعات المختلفة للمجلة حوالي 6 ملايين شخص، تطبع 900 ألف نسخة، منها 590 ألف نسخة خارج الولايات المتحدة في الصين وإسرائيل وكوريا وتركيا وروسيا وبولندا وغيرها من الدول. ضيف حلقة اليوم أيضا خاض انتخابات الحزب الجمهوري للترشح لرئاسة الولايات المتحدة عامي 96 و2000، ومن أفكاره ضريبة موحدة، حسابات ادخار للتأمين الصحي، نظام جديد للتقاعد. في عهد الرئيس رونالد ريغان عين رئيسا لمجلس إدارة BIB، وهو المجلس الذي يراقب ويتابع نشاط الإعلام الأمريكي الخارجي، الإعلام الحكومي. ضيف حلقة اليوم هو ستيف فوربس، رئيس مجلس إدارة ورئيس تحرير فوربس. Steve, Happy New Year and thank you for being with us for the second time.
Thank you, my pleasure. Happy New Year to you, Mohammed.
Thank you. Steve, the recovery in U.S. looks good, but we still face the big problem. The unemployment rate still high. Do you think the new Congress can do something better about this issue? And what is the best way to create more jobs in U.S.?
Well, I think the new Congress has already had an impact even after the elections. It was their winning those November midterm elections that put pressure on the administration to extend the Bush tax rates for another 2 years, which is why December was very good for the stock market. And I think in the months ahead, this new Congress will put pressure on the administration through various legislative devices to begin to cut back on the increase in government spending. So that'll be helpful to the economy. And I think the big debate is going to be on health care. That's going to rear up again as this new Congress tries to peel away some of the provisions of Obamacare. But I think overall 2011 will be good for the economy, because not only on the federal level in the United States, but on the state level, you're going to see pressure to cut back on government spending.
How that will be reflected on the job market or labor market?
Well, what you're going to see is an increase in jobs this year. Companies have put off hiring as long as they could, but with the economy growing at a 3 to 4% real growth rate, there will be more private sector job creation. Not as much as we would like, probably about 2.5 million jobs this year, but that won't make too much of a dent in the 14.5 million people unemployed, but it will be a step in the right direction. But there's still a lot of uncertainty out there that'll hurt job creation. I mentioned health care. The weak dollar is also hurting, and the uncertainty of what's going to happen to taxes after 2 years will hurt as well, because as you know, many investment projects have more than a 2-year time horizon. So better than 2010, but not nearly as well as it should be.
But Steve, weak dollar has 2 faces. One of them is positive, which is increasing the competitive of the U.S. exports.
Well, the increase you get in exports from cheapening your money are usually short-lived, because markets adjust as they see the discrepancies in the marketplace. To make it simple, if you sell a bottle of wine for the equivalent of 4 loaves of bread, and you notice you're only getting the equivalent of 2 loaves of bread, you're going to readjust your prices. So if cheapening your money was the way to wealth, Zimbabwe and Argentina would own the world today. We should have learned this lesson from the 1970s, because also when you cheapen your currency, you pay more for imports such as oil. So and you also get more uncertainty at home. Since the dollar's been cheapened in recent years, U.S. markets have not done very well, and capital has gone from the United States, true investment capital has gone from the United States to Asia. So stable money is the best way to get one of the key things of getting sustainable growth.
If this is the right way, why Chinese are not comply with the U.S. demand and other countries' demand to rethink about the yuan value?
Well, some countries still have a mercantilist approach, but as you know, in China itself, they're now being hit with some real inflationary pressures, as are other countries, particularly in food. It's not just food supply that is affecting food prices, but also the cheapening of currencies around the world. We saw the same phenomenon a couple of years ago when currencies were cheapened, and also in the 1970s. And I think in terms of China, it is a mistake for the United States to put pressure on China to revalue its currency. What we should be focusing on are real issues that we have with China, such as trade barriers and theft of intellectual property.
Standard & Poor's and Moody's warn on U.S. credit rating today. That means the cost of borrowing money will be expensive. How do you think United States can avoid that, to downgrade its credit rating?
Well, the only reason interest rates have remained low in the United States is because the Federal Reserve has artificially suppressed them. But that's not going to be able to last forever. And also our Treasury Department has been very stingy in issuing 10-year bonds and 30-year bonds, so the supply has been artificially suppressed. But nonetheless, in the next 2 to 3 years, interest rates will be going up, which will increase the cost of borrowing. But I think what Moody's and S&P are missing is that there are now real political pressures in the U.S. to cut spending. Most states are starting to make big cutbacks in spending. I come from the state of New Jersey, and last year they passed a budget where the spending levels were less than they were 4 years ago. And you're starting to see new governors coming in this month in the U.S. Most of them are cutting back on spending because they know it is unsustainable. So the U.S. political process is beginning to make the reforms that I think will save us from financial trouble in the future. The big unknown is what the Federal Reserve is going to do. They have to stop this binge on printing money. And the sooner they do, I think the quicker and more sustainable recovery we will get in the U.S.
Japan followed China, and they announced they will start to buy euro bonds. How that will affect the U.S. bonds in the market? We know many governments and many companies buying U.S. bonds as a safe investment. Now, do you think many governments will follow China and Japan and start to buy euro bonds?
Well, many of them are starting to do that, but the challenge is that the euro bond market is not similar to the U.S. Treasury market. In Europe, you have many entities issuing euro bonds. It's not a general European Union bond, it's of specific countries. And one of the things that's happened is that the European Central Bank has been behaving almost as badly as our Federal Reserve in printing too much money. So in that sense, governments are going from, as we say in the U.S., from the frying pan into the fire. Both euro bonds and Treasury bonds, I would stay away from both right now.
China is pushing its currency, the yuan, to be a global currency. How much they will succeed, and do you think that can be done on the short term? And can yuan threaten U.S. as a global currency in the future?
Well, the yuan could be a threat in the future in the sense that people would want to use it for international transactions. That's how the dollar became the global currency. It wasn't designed by governments. It was the strength and size of the U.S. economy. China is growing, as we all know, very rapidly, but it has a long ways to go to achieve the size of the U.S. economy. And very importantly, China must open up its capital markets. They are still very simple. They don't have the depth and breadth of the U.S. capital markets. So until they liberalize their capital markets, their currency won't achieve global status.
Steve, do you think Europeans deal with big and huge debt problem right now? How do you see the situation in Europe this year regarding the debt, and especially in Spain, in Portugal, in Italy?
Well, as you know, the Portuguese bond sale went okay. Maybe it was the Chinese that scooped it up. But I think don't be surprised in the next 12 months or so that a country like Greece, which is still not yet out of the woods, is going to have to restructure its debt. And I think the European Central Bank has been making a mistake buying these bonds because that puts off the restructuring that's needed. And if the European Central Bank would follow the example of the old German central bank, the Bundesbank, and to try to make the euro a strong currency like the Swiss franc, the currency can survive problems in countries like Portugal, Spain, and Italy.
فاصل قصير نعود بعده لمواصلة الحوار مع ستيف فوربس رئيس مجلس إدارة ورئيس تحرير فوربس. أهلا ومرحبا بكم مرة أخرى وهذه الحلقة من وول ستريت. ضيف حلقة اليوم هو ستيف فوربس رئيس مجلس إدارة ورئيس تحرير فوربس. Steve, welcome again.
Thank you.
Steve, we have or we face two big challenges worldwide now: food and energy, supplies and prices. How dangerous is these two challenges on the world economy, and how can world deal with those two problems?
Well, the most critical one, of course, is food. And I think what you're seeing happening in food is a combination of supply shocks from bad weather and harvests, but also what happens when you cheapen money. And that is people start to speculate in commodities in ways they don't do when currencies are stable, and that drives the prices up as well. So it feeds on itself. And so I think a key thing on the food front is for the U.S. to stabilize the dollar. I think that would take a lot of pressure off of commodities, including food. And on the energy front, what is amazing is the increased supply of energy. There are big new oil discoveries. Very importantly, there are massive new finds and technology developments that allow the exploitation of natural gas. And a new process called fracking, which in effect takes water, shoots it way underground, breaks rocks, and releases natural gas. Hydraulic fracturing, they call it. And that's is going to have a vast increase in the supply of natural gas, not only in the United States, but in other countries. So on the energy front, I think the price you see today, again, is partially a reflection of the weak dollar. If the dollar was stable, I think you'd see oil down in the range of $50 a barrel instead of $90 a barrel. And in terms of supply, what's happening in natural gas is absolutely extraordinary. And I think, too, you're going to see countries, as some of them are already doing more in the future on nuclear power, which will also increase energy supply, certainly for electricity.
Steve, banks now in U.S., they have more money, they have more cheap money actually, but they still not push this money or give this money to the market. Why? And what we should do to give this money to investors, to people to lend, and to push the economic growth again?
Well, this is a reflection of a couple of things. One is that with the Federal Reserve artificially suppressing short-term interest rates to almost zero, banks are able to get money at almost 0% and then lend it back to the government or to AAA companies and make a very nice profit. There's no incentive for them to go out long-term. The Federal Reserve on bank reserves is paying interest. So you have that constraint, artificially low rates, no incentive for banks to go out to lend. And then another thing that's held things back is that regulators, bank examiners, have been going to banks and putting pressure on them about loans to businesses, especially small businesses. So banks know they're going to have a lot of trouble when they make those loans. I think the regulators will start to back off this year, and I think you'll see more lending to smaller businesses. But another thing, a third thing that's holding things back, is that a lot of businesses don't want to borrow the money because of the remaining uncertainties in the economy. So they're being very cautious. And so even though the banks have a lot of money, and even though the Federal Reserve is printing more money, it reminds us of a phrase we first heard in the 1930s, and that is pushing on a string. And so instead of printing more money, what the authorities should be doing is removing the barriers for people to borrow, whether it's regulatory barriers, the cheap dollar barriers, and the uncertainty about regulations. They start to remove those uncertainties, and I think you'll see very good loan demand.
Steve, why do you think Obama administration plan to stop foreclosures did not succeed? And foreclosures now is going up to a record number last year, and most of experts, they expect it to go on and increase during 2011. Why, and what is the best way to deal with this big problem?
Well, the problem is, in terms of housing, is that there's still a lot of people out there who should not have bought houses in the first place. And the reason they did it was because of the bubble, the cheap money, government putting pressure on banks to make loans, subprime loans, federal Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac doing the same thing. So you have hundreds of thousands of homeowners out there who should really just give up on their houses. They can't afford them. They, even though they extend payment schedules, even though they reduce principal, a lot of people just cannot afford those houses, and so they should be allowed to move on, go into rentals, and allow the market to clear. And the quicker the market clears, the faster I think housing will come back in the U.S. In a normal economy, Mohammed, we need 1.5 million new houses a year in the U.S. because of wear and tear and increase in population. We're only building a fraction of that today, and those are usually rentals. So if they allow the markets to clear, people who cannot afford a house should be allowed to walk away from them, let the inventory be sold, and I think within 2 or 3 years you'll start to see a real housing boom again just because of increased population and replacing old structures.
U.S. is pushing reform in the Middle East very hard. Do you believe political reform should come first or economic reform come first? And before you answer, I want to remind you with the situation in Gaza. We have Hamas government. They came and they took power after a free and fair elections.
Well, the key thing in terms of, I think, making lasting progress in the Middle East is pushing economic reforms. And we should be pressuring governments to liberalize their economies, to make it easy to set up legal businesses, make it easier for people to enforce contracts and the like. And when that happens, then you start to develop a growing middle class, which makes possible political changes and makes possible, I think, successful negotiations. We should look at the example, even though it's a very different part of the world, I think the principle still holds, of Northern Ireland, where for 300 years you had fighting between Protestants and Catholics. What made possible the diplomatic progress there in recent years was what happened in the Republic of Ireland, which had a great economic boom for 25 years. They made structural changes. Now today Ireland is suffering a severe recession, but even today their per capita income is still higher than that of Britain or France or Germany. And it was the boom in Ireland that made possible a change in the political environment in Northern Ireland and some of the diplomatic progress there. So I think if we get more economic progress, which comes from economic liberalization, simplified tax codes and the like, as we saw in places like Singapore, the Baltic states like Estonia, then I think you can make progress more easily on other fronts.
Steve, do you think U.S. aid system, especially to the Middle East countries, needs a reform? Because U.S. just gave Jordan $100 million this week, and U.S. used to give Israel, Egypt, other countries in the Middle East millions and billions of dollars. And we didn't see any change in the standard of living for the people in these countries.
Well, what made possible the growth in the Israeli economy was not the aid, but the changes they made several years ago in their tax structures and regulatory structures. Egypt has made some changes, but I think they must do more. And we and others should be urging other countries to make substantial changes economically. And when you do that, I think you will start to create forces in those countries that'll make progress in other areas possible.
Steve, many countries in the Middle East now, they have troubles and riots over the economic situations, and governments there, they are hesitated to apply new taxes or not apply new taxes. What is the solution to stabilize these countries economically?
Well, I think they should try to follow basic principles, and that is a stable currency. They should also simplify their tax structures and make them more transparent. Follow the example of Hong Kong, Singapore, Estonia, and others that have done that. And make some of these institutional reforms, such as make it easy to set up a legal business, make it easier to enforce contracts, have transparency in bankruptcy laws and the like. All of these boring things, property rights are absolutely critical. And if they start to put in that kind of regime, you're going to see those countries start to grow. Entrepreneurial energies will start to create real growth. And each year, the World Bank comes out with a survey called Doing Business, which surveys over 175 economies around the world on things like property rights, taxation, enforcement of contracts. And countries that make substantial progress in those areas are countries that are starting to show some real economic growth. So if we follow those basic principles, even though they may not be the most exciting subjects in the world, like property rights, they do lay the foundations for more sustainable and greater growth in the future.
Steve, what do you want to say to the people in the Middle East through Al Hurra and through this show in the new year?
My urging in the new year would be to urge governments to make substantial liberalizations in their economies. And you can see what other countries around the world have done in that respect. And that way, I think you'll lay the foundations for a very, very good future. There's no reason why the Middle East shouldn't be in the forefront of economic growth.
بهذا تنتهي هذه الحلقة من وول ستريت، قدمناها لحضراتكم من ناسداك، من التايمز سكوير، من نيويورك. شكرا لكم وإلى اللقاء الأسبوع القادم.